Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the mid-year Freak Out book tag. I was tagged by Jess from Garden Scriptorium, and I'll link her channel below, and this tag was created by Read Like Wildfire and Earl Grey Books, and I will link both of them below as well. Question number 1 is the best book you've read so far in 2017. That was tough because I had a couple that I probably liked equally. But since I'm going to talk about one of them for another question, I'm going to go with Hisham Matar's In the Country of Men, which is a novel about a 9-year-old boy living in Tripoli, right on the cusp of some major political change, and that major political change is touching on his family and his neighbors, and being a child, he only has a limited understanding of what's going on with that, and by telling the story through that child's eyes, it's kind of a fascinating exercise in frustration where you're watching this kid try to figure these things out, and he doesn't always get it right, and he doesn't always understand 100% what's going on. And it was just a really interesting way to look at a very specific place and a very specific time. So I thought this was fantastic. Number 2 is the best sequel that you've read in 2017. And I think the best sequel that I read was Volume 3 of March, which is John Lewis's graphic memoir retelling of the US civil rights movement of the 60s. I think I only read a handful of real sequels this year, but yeah, this is definitely the best of them. Question number 3 is new release that you haven't read yet but want to. I usually try not to read the big award winners the same year that they're on everybody's lists, but I have heard so many good things about Frances Spufford's Golden Hill, especially listening to both Jess from Garden Scriptorium, who tagged me for this, she's talked about it a lot, and also Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, have both made that sound more interesting in a way that isn't just awards hype. So I am interested to read that. Question number 4 is your most anticipated release for the second half of the year, and I'm looking forward to picking up the collected edition of Wildstorm, the book that Warren Ellis did for DC Comics recently. I thought about picking it up as monthlies, but decided against it, so it will be my first time reading it when that comes out in a couple months. Question number 5 is your biggest disappointment. I think my biggest disappointment this year was Kamal El-Solih's memoir Intolerable. I knew his writing from his work as a theater critic in the Globe and Mail, and I always thought that he was a solid critic. And his family lived through some really fascinating times in Yemen, Lebanon, and Egypt, and he had an interesting path before he himself moved to Canada. So I was expecting to really be engaged in his memoir of all of those things, and yet the writing in this is not particularly engaging. It's a lot of statements about things happened and not a lot of getting into the real deepness of it. It's a very shallow look at a lot of really interesting things. I'm still glad that I read it because, as I said, his family lived through some interesting times, but as a piece of writing, it didn't live up to what I hoped it would. Question number 7 is your favorite new author. And my favorite new author is Harry Parker, who wrote Anatomy of a Soldier, which was just about a tie with Country of Men for my favorite book that I've read so far this year. This is a fantastic writing experiment in addition to being a novel on its own. It is the parallel stories of a British Army captain and a teenage Afghan insurgent that is narrated by their things. So the first chapter in this is narrated by a tourniquet. The final chapter in this is narrated by a prosthetic. And it jumps back and forth in time, back and forth between the two characters, and just was one of those things where as a writing experiment it was really interesting, and as a story it was really compelling. I thought this was spectacular, and I'll be curious to see what this author does next. Question number 8 is newest fictional crush, which, no, sorry. Question number 6 is biggest surprise. And the biggest surprise for me was The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps by Kai Ashanti Wilson. I just talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and it is basically an epic fantasy in a short form that does really brilliant and really interesting things with language and code switching. We're so accustomed, or at least I'm so accustomed, to seeing fantasy that is straightforward and linear, and when it's interesting because they do things with character or with world building, and not so much language. But this was interesting in what it did with language, and I love that. I wish we saw more fantasy that tried to do interesting things with language. So yeah, great surprise. Most favorite character, and I don't know if this is really a favorite character, but the character that I guess impressed me the most was character Jim in It Swim Two Boys, which at its base, this story is clearly heading for tragedy, and yet you have this character Jim who is absolutely optimistic about not necessarily his own future, but about the future of society and societal attitudes and like progress, which I thought was impressive. But you read a lot of stories that have a tragic bent, and the characters feel like they're plotting towards this destiny that they can't do anything about. But here's an optimistic, the optimism impressed me with the character. So I don't know if that's really the way people talk about favorite characters, but yeah. Question number 10 is a book that made you cry. And I normally don't cry at a lot of books, but Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which is Caitlin Doughtry's memoir of her first year in the funeral industry. There's one chapter in here that is dedicated to the cremation of infants. It was heartbreaking. There's one bit where she's musing on the infants that are, baby last name versus the ones that have a full name, and what that means in terms of hope and what the parents' dreams were. And yeah, it almost makes me want to cry thinking about it. It was, and I read that months ago, so it gets you. And question number 11 is a book that made you happy. And I just talked about this in my last wrap-up, but a book that made me grin was The Chronicles of Wormwood: The Last Battle, which is not a book that's going to be for everyone, but it is Garth Ennis at his gross-out humor plus religious criticism best, and the talking rabbit in this slays me. So I sit there grinning even when this is ridiculous and disgusting. So yeah. Alright, I think I'm doing some of these a little out of order. Alright, next question. Favorite book to movie adaptation that you saw this year? I've seen exactly one movie in the cinemas this year, and that was Logan, which is sort of an adaptation of Old Man Logan, and I did enjoy it, so although, since it's the only one that I saw, by default it has to be my favorite, right? Next up, what is the most beautiful book that you've bought so far this year? And I think the best looking book that I bought this year is Michael Hogg's Eye of Newt, which is a really nicely illustrated fantasy graphic novel, which I actually haven't read yet, so I'm trying not to look at it carefully, but from when I've flipped through it, it is awfully pretty. Favorite video that you've made this year? I had fun doing the bookish scavenger hunt. I thought that was fun, especially now that I've moved, so my shelves are in different places, and I did that sort of moving between rooms, so I'll go with that one. And I think that's all the questions. I think I'm a few weeks behind in doing this, so I think almost everyone who has wanted to do this has done it already. But if you haven't done this tag yet, I'm tagging you. And so consider yourself tagged. Thanks again to Jess from Garden Scriptorium for tagging me, and that's it for now. Ciao.